Yate Bene. Good morning, my relatives. It's Mark Charles. It is Wednesday, May 26th, and I'm sitting down here in my lands, in my house in the lands of the Piscataway, in what's now known as Washington, D.C., and I'm drinking my second cup of coffee. And I wanted to have a brief discussion about what's been going on in the Middle East, especially regarding the recent announcements about humanitarian aid to Gaza. So I'll be talking about that in just a few moments. But before I begin, as I always do, let me start by just acknowledging the people whose land I'm on. And so I'm living in Washington, D.C. with my family, and I want to just publicly state that these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway. I want to acknowledge that they are still here. I want to publicly state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. And I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. I want to share this live stream really quick on my YouTube channel with my Twitter feed. So give me just a second to get this going. This won't take very long. But let me just get this going real quick. Sorry about this. Okay. So, yeah, I want to talk to you a little bit today about what I've been reading going on in the Middle East, especially with the war in Israel and in Gaza, and with what's been happening, and even with some of the aid that's been promised. And so I'm not going to go into the whole depths of this conflict and all the way back 2 years ago, but just to share a few things so we're all on the same page. I'm going to share this one story. I'll put this into the comments, so hopefully you can catch them. This is a story by AP regarding Israel and Hamas's agreement to a ceasefire. This was just regarding the recent war, the 11-day war that happened in the Middle East. At least 230 Palestinians were killed, including 65 children and 39 women, with about 1,700 people being wounded total in Gaza. This is according to the Gaza Health Ministry, and they don't break those numbers down into fighters versus civilians. Next, we have 12 people were killed in Israel, including a 5-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl. Last week, President Joe Biden made some remarks regarding the ceasefire, and I'm going to be referencing them a little bit, so I'm going to put them into the comment section as well. This is the text of his words, and then there's also a YouTube video of those same remarks that I'm going to put also into the chat. And in those remarks, Joe Biden, well, there's a lot of history we need to talk about here. One of the things we got to start with is last April. So the Trump administration cut off aid to the people of Gaza. And last April, so a month and a half ago, Joe Biden restored that aid, which goes through the UN, for the people of Palestine. And he restored about $235 million in aid. This, of course, was before the war. And then as the protests got increasingly more pointed, and then eventually, and these protests were about the removal of Palestinian people from their homes, right, to make way for Israeli settlers. And there was one final court case that was going through, and those protests were what eventually resulted in the 11-day war that happened. And so before that war broke out, the U.S. promised to restore $235 million in aid to the Palestinian people. Then during the war, literally while Israel was bombing the crap out of Gaza and destroying not only military targets, but also homes and apartment buildings and trying to destroy tunnels, again, over 230 people were killed, and dozens of children and women were killed. During that fighting, the Biden administration approved $735 million in weapon sales to Israel while the fighting is going on. And then in his remarks that I posted recently, and this was last Friday, once the ceasefire was signed, President Biden promised rapid humanitarian aid. And Secretary of State Blinken has actually been in Israel this week, meeting with both Israeli leaders as well as Palestinian leaders, and promising humanitarian aid, most pointedly to the people of Gaza, who not only were there hundreds killed and 1,700 wounded, but I've heard over 10,000 people were left homeless due to this. It's a humanitarian crisis right now in Gaza, which already has little resources and is struggling with vaccines and keeping COVID under control. And now on top of that, we have this incredibly bloody one-sided war that took place with Israel. And as I was reading through and reflecting on these things, it reminded me a lot of sort of the same emotions and the feelings I had when we lived back on the Navajo Nation on the reservation. And I remember one of the ways when I first began observing, I was living on the reservation. I forget even if we were living in the Hogan at that point. And we were 6 miles off the nearest road on a paved road, off the nearest paved road on a dirt road, lived in a one-room Hogan, no running water, no electricity. Our neighbors that we lived with were shepherds and rug weavers. And as I was observing that in modern day marginalization of our Native peoples, as I was experiencing it, living in that remote location, as I was watching how the press, politicians literally ignored our people and came to the conclusion that really the only group of non-natives who come to Indian reservations are those who come to take your picture, or those who come to give you charity. And mostly they're the same groups of people, and largely they're just evangelical Christians coming to do missions and to convert the merciless Indian savages to Western culture and Christianity. And as I was observing this, one of the first ways I began to articulate how it felt is I said I felt like living in that space. There was this massive tank that was rolling through our land. It was destroying homes. It was running over livestock and destroying crops. It was causing tremendous damage, but it was moving slowly. And there were a bunch of people sitting on the tank, and the tank was just moving through our land. And I felt like I was running alongside the tank, begging for the people to stop it, telling the people, you're running over, you're destroying our land, you're destroying our homes, you're destroying our crops, and begging people to stop the tank. And the people who were on the tank, they're like, they looked at us, they had pity on us. They're like, we feel bad. This is horrible. We don't, but this tank is so big. I'm not driving and I don't know how to stop it. And so they just sat there and they felt pity, and maybe they would throw food off the tank and try to help us as their tank was rolling through, destroying us. And this is literally how it felt living on the reservation, where the very people who are coming to offer you assistance, right, are also the same people who are part of this machine that are causing the destruction. And that is literally the relationship that almost every marginalized group of people here in North America has with the United States of America. And I'm sure that's the relationship that I've witnessed, that same relationship around the world, where this colonial machine known as Western European culture, known as the American way of doing things, right? It rolls through your area and it literally destroys it. And then running behind it, or even riding on the same tank that's doing the destruction, are these well-intentioned people throwing off donations and dropping off food and throwing scraps of wood and metal so you can rebuild some a little bit as this tank is destroying the things that's happening. And then expecting praise, expecting gratitude, expecting thankfulness for their generosity. And I see that everywhere. I saw that for 11 years on the Navajo Nation. I traveled overseas and went to many places, both with Christian mission groups. I often traveled alone, but I would interact with agencies in countries around the world, and I would try to meet one-on-one with local people, and would have local hosts, stay with local hosts, and not go as a part of the mission establishment that they were so used to observing. And you would just see the same thing happening over and over and over. And the problem is right, the problem is it creates a dependence, because not only is it destroying your way of life and your homelands and your people, but then you become dependent upon the little tokens of generosity that are being thrown from the tank to try and rebuild. And so you have to follow the tank, because you no longer have the ability to grow your crops, or to raise your livestock, or to even live in your homes. And so you're now dependent to run after the tank and wait for the little things they throw off the tank to try and help you. And it creates this dependency that is not only unhealthy and toxic, but I would argue it's abusive. It's abusive, this relationship that gets created there. Because the people who are riding the tank, throwing off their generous goods, right, they feel no responsibility, or at least they're like, I can't control this, so it's just happening. Even though I'm on the tank, I'm doing my part to help you as we're destroying your way of life. And then they expect to be thanked for that. And so the fact that the United States of America stands so closely with Israel, while Israel is so intentionally mistreating the Palestinian people, and I would argue the Bedouins. I always add the Bedouins into the mix as well. And we defend, we stand, we protect Israel's right to defend itself. We protect Israel's right to exist. And I don't disagree that because of the history, there needs to be some way of making sure that Israel does not go through what it went through during World War II ever again. But we support their colonial relationship and their abusive and oppressive relationship with the Palestinian people. We arm them. We sell them the weapons that they use to bomb the crap out of Gaza. And then we pledge assistance to help Gaza rebuild. And then we expect to be thanked, which is destructive. It's abusive, it's toxic. And that cycle needs to be broken. It absolutely needs to be broken. When I lived on the reservation and I saw it happening in front of my very eyes, I began finding myself speaking more and more pointedly to the missionaries who were coming to the reservation. First, I tried to train them in a way to come in a more healthy manner with less of their expectations of assimilation. And I would tell them that you're coming to our land and you're joining our culture, and you need to understand that comes with a level of uncomfortability, and you can't expect us to assimilate to you or to adhere to your timelines and to your criteria. You are coming to us. And I would work very hard to train people, to train teams, and to work with organizations who were coming. But they still continued coming, and they still continued causing damage. And so eventually, my last 2 years there living on the reservation, I just flat out started telling mission teams, don't come. You're not being helpful. And you're actually perpetuating the problem. We don't need the type of assistance that you're offering. And then I would say, and if you're going to come in a way that is going to actually be so challenging to you, you're never going to come anyway. And I actually really wish other nations would flat out say to the United States, we don't want your help. I wish there was a scenario where the people of Gaza would say to Secretary of State Blinken, keep your bullshit aid. We don't want it. You want to help us? Stop selling weapons to Israel. Keep your bullshit aid. But because our relationship and its toxicity creates a dependence, that rarely gets spoken. Right? What's so fascinating right now is China is just getting to the point where they are strong enough and powerful enough where they are starting to say this to the United States. We don't need your aid. We don't need your help. We're not going to kiss your butt. They're starting to say that to us, which is good. We need more nations around the world to say, we don't need your toxic generosity, your toxic charity, your toxic abusive relationship. You want to help us? Stop being so colonial and stop supporting colonialism. That will help us. Coming through and helping us rebuild after you arm the people who bombed us, we don't need that kind of help. I tweeted yesterday this disparity between we're promising aid to Gaza while arming Israel. And I ended that tweet by saying, this is why white landowning men should not be involved in the Middle East peace process. Right? Secretary of State Blinken, Joe Biden, most of the Harvard graduates on his staff, many of whom are white, have no business, have no integrity to travel to the Middle East to try to negotiate peace. They haven't done squat to address the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the Jim Crow laws in our own country. They can't even name the name of the native nation whose land they're living on, where their own house is built. And we're sending them overseas to the Middle East to solve a land conflict that is 2,000 years in the making, maybe even longer, 4,000 years in the making. They have no integrity. They have nothing to offer except their colonial wealth, which they make by arming certain groups of people, and then they restore their reputation by offering humanitarian aid and creating a dependency upon the people that are getting bombed. It's toxic, it's destructive, it's abusive. And we need more nations to say, just honestly, to the United States of America, to President Biden, to Secretary of State Blinken, we don't need your help. You want to help us quit being colonial. But we're not going to accept help from the same nation that armed the country that bombed us. But it's very difficult to get to that point. Right? And we see this even today. And I'm slowly building this analysis. I'm not quite there yet. I didn't say much about, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the lynching of George Floyd. And I'm still deeply struggling with how to fully address that within the Biden administration. Because he is showing himself to be the friend and the comforter of the Floyd family. And he was hoping to have this law passed by the 1 anniversary of his death. But he's also promised he is not open to rethinking how we do policing in this nation. He's not open to it. He'll make some cosmetic changes, but he's not open. And we cannot celebrate that trial as a new era of justice in this nation. Why? Because the guy was found guilty only after we had 9 minutes of live stream video and numerous eyewitnesses. Right? This isn't a new era of justice. Yes, I'm glad that Derek Chauvin was found guilty. But this isn't a new era of justice. We haven't had systemic change. We've got one conviction. And so I'm slowly building my critique of the Biden administration. But while it's not as explicit as the Trump administration's relationship with the Palestinians and with people of color here in the US, because it's still rooted in the same colonialism and in perpetuating the status quo, it's actually doing more damage. And I need to get to a point where I can call it out even more clearly than I've been trying to do in the past few weeks. But this one issue, when I saw what we were doing by offering aid to Gaza as well as selling weapons to Israel, I'm like, this is just too much. This is toxic. This is abusive. And I encourage the Palestinian people. I hope they accept. I'm assuming they'll take the aid. I really hope they don't thank us for it. I really, really hope the Palestinian people do not say thank you to the United States of America for the aid that we are going to try to offer them. Because we don't deserve any thanks. Our nation does not deserve thanks for the aid that we're offering to the people of Gaza. We arm the people who bombed them. We don't deserve thanks for helping them rebuild. Those are my thoughts. I hope I haven't done a live stream in several days since last week, so I wanted to jump on and talk a few things this morning as I drank my second cup of coffee. Yeah, I hope these are helpful thoughts, and I would love to see this issue engaged better, not just here in the US, but globally. I hope that more nations will have the courage to speak truthfully to the United States of America. I hope that more people will have the courage to be honest with the United States of America about what they really need us to do, and not just thank us for our colonial generosity and our abusive relationship that we have with countless nations and peoples around the world. I can't have my relatives walk in beauty, and maybe learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakone.